It's a great pleasure to be able to introduce our next speaker in this new JRF series of talks. It's Kate Herrity, who's going to tell us about sound, emotion and survival in prisons. Over to you, Kate.
Thank you, Anne. Thanks everyone for coming on this almost spring-like Monday evening, she says. I have very cleverly managed to put my contact details in the corner where certainly they're obscured from my view, but if you should want to email me for any reason, please do so. You'll also find me on Twitter. I'm often to be found on Twitter, particularly if I have things I ought to be getting on with. So as JRF in punishment, it's no particular surprise, but at the same time slightly unusual in this particular context that I am a criminologist. Although my academic identity is a little bit more fluid in the sense that I choose and engage with ideas from a broad range of fields and disciplines. I offer not to use visual aids because much of my talk is about the sensory, so the slides don't contain any incredibly important information if you don't wish to look at them. So I'm going to introduce my current research by way of a brief tour through past projects and the ideas that underpin them. By the time we arrive at the end, you will know a little more about the prison environment and the experience of researching within it. And while academically, that may not be your area of interest in any particular sense, I hope at least to impress upon you the social significance of thinking about prisons, the prisons in our midst. So I'm going to start by talking about violence. By violence, I mean both in the more direct and usual sense of behaviour involving physical force likely to result in hurt or damage to personal property, and violence in a broader sense, a strength of emotion or a natural force, perhaps relating to destructiveness rather than itself destructive. How do we understand such things and how do we convey them? By way of demonstration, I want to begin in 1912, the First Balkan War, and Tommaso Marinetti's account of the siege of Adrianople, which was successfully captured by the Bulgarian army shortly after. Marinetti witnessed this in his role as a reporter and sought to convey his impressions of being in the midst of battle. His intent was to mediate the sounds of explosion and gunfire using concrete poetry and typographical experimentation. His poem, Zang Tum Tum, was intended to demonstrate that sound carried more power than the verbal meaning attached to what we commonly recognize as words. For our purposes, we'll gloss over unfortunate associations with the development of Italian fascism and the glorification of war, which is in no way to suggest those aren't important, of course. So herewith, Marinetti reading Zang Tum Tum.
Ogni 5 secondi, cannoni d'assedio, spentare spazio con un accordo. Bam, bum, bum. A un tiramento di 500 echi per affannarlo, sminuzzarlo, sparpagliarlo all'infinito. Nel centro di quei pom pum, spiaccicati, ampiezza 50 km quadrati, balzare scoppi, tagli, pugni, batteria tiro rapido, violenza, ferocia, regolarità. Questo passo grave, scandali strani, folli agitatissimi, acuti della battaglia, furia, affanno, orecchie, occhi, narici, aperti, che gioia, vedere, udire, fiutare, tutto, taratatà delle mitragliatrici, strigliare per rifiato sotto morsi, schiaffi, pitta puntum, pitta puntum.
I hope he forgives me posthumously for cutting him off so abruptly. In his 2012 book, Sonic Warfare, Sound, Affect and the Ecology of Fear, Steve Goodman explores the power and violence of sensory imposition, specifically sound. Fear induced purely by sound effects, or at least in the undecidability between an actual or sonic attack, is a virtualized fear. The threat becomes autonomous from the need to back it up. And yet the sonically induced fear is no less real. The same dread of an unwanted possible future is activated, perhaps all the more powerful for its spectral presence. Despite the rhetoric, such deployments do not necessarily attempt to deter enemy action, to ward off an undesirable future, but are as likely to prove provocative, to increase the likelihood of conflict, to precipitate that future. What I seek to emphasise before we go off on too much of an Italian futurist or psychoacoustics tangent, not that those things are not relevant in some tangential sense, is the very real effects Goodman identifies as resulting from a sensory onslaught. That conveying sensory violence, by which I mean the idea that making sounds or perhaps sights, smells, textures with force and power can be in and of itself violent, or a violence in intention and or effect. In 2018, my colleagues and I presented at the European Society of Criminology conference in Sarajevo. Our panel was concerned with the implications for knowledge as well as how we go about acquiring it, of attending more closely to sensory dimensions in experiences of spaces of punishment. And so our recently released edited collection, Sensory Penalities, exploring the sensory in spaces of punishment and social control, was born. It has been available at the Cambridge Library for several weeks now, rolling unlimited e-access. So you can access it without leaving the comfort of your armchairs. I'm sure you're very keen to do so. It is a very good read, if I do say so myself. I'm quite proud of it. And look how pretty. However, in her chapter, Sensing an Unease in Immigration Confinement, an Abolitionist's Perspective, Vicky Canning talks about her disorientation in navigating what she terms a triangle of variable confinements in Denmark. While this referred specifically to the sites in which she was conducting research, her discombobulation in the field resulted from a violent proximity, sensorially, experientially, as well as geographically, between these places of confinement and the reminders of violence of warfare offered by the adjacently situated military barracks. She talks about the harmful effects of asylum detention for those who have frequently escaped from war zones and find themselves sensorially assailed with reminders from nearby military maneuvers, as well as the tightening strategies of confinement. In the course of her exploration, she makes powerful parallels with her own experiences growing up in Northern Ireland in the 80s and 90s. There are then comparisons to be drawn between states of violence and sites of violence, for those who were wondering whether prison was going to make an appearance. I'm not the first to suggest that prison can be so understood. Of course, there are numerous articulations of this in both academic literature and prisoner accounts. One such account is Hassein's Life Without Parole. His evocative account of serving a life sentence in maximum security paints a vivid picture of living in a perpetual state of what Crew et al. Term consumptive wariness, being constantly on your guard, nervous and wary. I knew I would have to submit to the cavity search, but it wasn't the strip search that dominated my memory of this event. It was the noise. Since concrete and steel do not absorb sound, the clamour and voices from within just bounced around, crashing into each other to create a hollow, booming echo that never ended. It sounded as if someone had placed a microphone inside a crowded locker room, with the volume pumped up, broadcasting the noise all around the sally port. It was this deafening background noise that would lull me to sleep at night and greet me in the morning for the next 5 years. Though I have been out of Greaterford for many years now, its constant din still echoes in my ears. Hassein has long since committed suicide, which adds a certain poignancy to the evocative picture he paints of his memories of the sensory experience of being confined, which are echoed in Jason War's chapter, also in Sensory Penalities, in which he talks about the experience of being locked within a cell while the prison is on fire, and how the power of that experience is underpinned by the lasting sensory assault, which re-triggers his memory of it. Fire, fire, the prison cell, and the thick sensuality of trappedness, as he calls it. But what I wish to talk about here is what accounting for sensory aspects of this does for our understanding of the prison soundscape. I'm just going to play you a short recording from when I left my recorder cheekily running while I was doing a little side project for the prison. Also a little bit of traveller-related racism in there. In 2019, I designed and began moderating a blog to accompany the book as a means of generating interest and, more importantly, expanding those conversations beyond our own field and focus. It's still going strong, and you can find it at this link, www.sensorycriminology.com. We have thus far had historians, politicians. My technical skills remain rather woeful, but the content is something I'm really fiercely proud of. Creative, innovative, always thought-provoking, and sometimes rather brave. Eleanor March, in her post on distance and sound in prisoner writing, draws our attention to comparisons made in prisoner writing between the violence of warfare and that of the prison soundscape. The whack and thump recalls the crack and thump of the deadly weapons in the battlefield scene, in an aural embodiment of the violence of prison enacted on human flesh. In this scenario, the language of proximity conveys the forced, unwanted physical proximity of prison life. Ultimately, the narrator's inability to decode the prison soundscape leaves him unable to adapt to prison life, and the story ends with his suicide. Using Bourdieu, I argue in my thesis that the soundscape is a site of symbolic violence. Sound forms a key component of power maintenance. Auditory signifiers of power resonate with the privilege on which it depends, and social memory is reconstituted in their hearing. For example, a prison officer can be transported back inside by the sudden sounding of an alarm, such as a car alarm. In prison, this summons staff to attend an incident, usually of violence. The jangle of keys can heighten the anxiety of a prisoner waiting to hear about a sickly loved one or possible move, whilst to an officer indicates the presence of backup and support of colleagues. The clanging of gates, the jangling of keys, reinforce the power and privilege those working for the prison have over those imprisoned within it. Those bangs and clangs, therefore, resonate with a force reverberating far beyond their hearing. If navigation of the soundscape can be understood as integral to processes of coping and adaptation on an individual level, we can see how this is also the case for an individual in relation to the collective. As Eleanor March asserts, the ecology of survival depends on learning how to navigate the cadence of the prison soundscape and perhaps the sensescape more broadly. Learning how to read prison sensescapes is bound up then with safety and survival for those living and working in these spaces. My thesis is that attending to sound or aural aspects of social experience de-articulates power and from order in prison, and in so doing lends additional dimensions to our understanding both of power and how it is enacted and constituted, and the ways in which order is maintained and disrupted on a basis detached from authority and the absence or presence of legitimacy. Now, this may seem a fairly academic point, but legitimacy, rooted in social and political theory, is perhaps the most enduring concept in prison studies of the last 50 years. This is the theoretical lens through which the basis for compliance for people going behind the door willingly, despite outnumbering prison staff several-fold, is rationalised. Disorder then is the departure point for much of prison studies, and riots, of course, such as Strangeways. In contrast, attending to the soundscape and using that as a focal point for inquiry reveals that in prison, it is the rhythms and routines of the everyday which form the benchmark against which deviations are interpreted. Sound and whether a day feels spiky or calm is a barometer for gauging the social climate. What does that mean for how we interpret the sensescape? In my chapter, Hearing Order in Flesh and Blood, Sense Making and Attunement in the Pub and the Prison, I refer to a point made by Derek, one of the senior prison officers I interviewed. Derek argued that key to his role was learning the everyday tune that's normal for here. He argued all prison spaces have their own, and it is deviations from this everyday tune that denote trouble. Trouble itself, by which I mean disruption, often violence, disorder, has a particular set of markers. I borrow from Lefebvre to refer to this as arrhythmia. The rhythms of daily life have fallen into a discordant state and are no longer complementing one another. as is the case in a polyrhythmic, everyday, normal tune, where the hustle and bustle of daily life hums with the toing and froing of everyday business. While my contribution to sensory penalities is primarily concerned with talking about what attending to sensory experience more closely does for how we understand the social world of the prison, I also use this as a means to explore a more practical demonstration of how we do this. I used my master's dissertation to explore the use of sound in methodology to understand prison life, and my doctoral research explored the significance of the prison soundscape using oral ethnography. I spent nearly 8 months, actually much longer than that, and I'm still in touch with people now, in a local men's prison, listening to and interrogating sonic aspects of social experience, along with everything else people wished to discuss with me, which was quite a broad and varied scope of inquiry. Not terribly surprisingly, given that you're sometimes the only person available to speak to. In providing something of a blueprint for revisiting these investigations, I borrow from organisational theory to detail the process of acclimation to the environment. Lefebvre tells us the role of the rhythm analyst is to listen to these noises, murmurs, cacophonies, until we can discern individual strands within them and then bring them back together for some sense of the social whole. Sensing these spaces, I argue, is a process consisting of incremental stages of familiarity and proficiency. These stages can broadly be understood as sense-making, acclimating and adapting to particular rules and rhythms of behaviour which have meaning in particular social contexts. Apply that to a library or a cafe or a pub. And then of attunement, becoming sufficiently familiar with these rhythms to decipher and interpret them. So I want to just play that short clip again of the prison soundscape. Now, banging is a feature of daily life inside, a means of communicating an array of things to wing and landing society from behind the door, where the vast majority of the community are kept for much of, or normally most of the day. And this is prior to COVID, where generally speaking, we're in 23 hours lockdown nowadays. So people spend all of their time behind this door, unable to see beyond their immediate periphery. But the banging in that previous clip, which may or may not be obvious to you, but of course I immediately recognize as the banging of a locked gate, a through passage, which is of course distinct from a prison door. This is a different kind of banging that is more indicative of that common feature of daily life coming from prisoners. And a prison officer shouting is another. Shouting is happening all the time. But of course, there's a fair distinction between recognizing that there is a heavy, steady, rhythmic bang and understanding this is impatience to be let out, or a reminder that the cell incumbent feels an injustice at not being. If someone feels they ought to be let out or they have something they wish to do, they may on occasion keep that up in a sustained way for the entirety of association. Now, if you can't escape that, either because you're working or you're attempting to have an incredibly sensitive conversation with somebody who may be telling you about a recent bereavement, for example, which wasn't uncommon. People would talk to me about all manner of things all day. It actually becomes incredibly difficult to attend to the human being in front of you. And of course, that has significant implications for the way we understand what it is to work in those environments, where people are generally also required to wear an earpiece, which is constantly feeding back from security and communicating around the prison. Prisons are often very disparate spaces. This prison, of course, was different from that in that it was comprised of one main wing. So the time I spent with most of the community. There is a difference too between that steady, rhythmic, rapid banging and a slow rhythmic banging. This represents a threat to the broader order. If taking place in the midst of lockdown, this provides a real and frightening reminder to staff that they are outnumbered, potentially overpowered, and only retain their position of authority by a grace that can be and may be withdrawn at any time. It's experienced as terrifying for staff and not something they tend to forget. Underpinning this is years of experience in the bar trade. I deployed this experience partially subconsciously, and only later did I reflect on the extent to which learning how to read a senscape to predict and manage violence had coloured my assumptions, my understanding of what it was I was hearing, as well as what it was I was attempting to listen for. I often did my own door at the weekends, and when we did have fights or disturbances, I would be involved in breaking those up as well as coordinating staff. And you become accustomed to reading the feel of the space. But of course, I wasn't immediately conscious that I was carrying and transferring these experiences with me. However, we argue that on the back of this, of becoming more attuned to what we're hearing for and attempting to read, we offer a means of focusing on the sensory, which holds the promise in turn of better representing the vagaries and vitality of human life within these penal spaces, and brings us closer to capturing our fellow humans, as Volcan entreats, as the sensate, suffering, skilled, sedimented and situated creatures we are. A sociology then of flesh and blood. For all the seeming strangeness of preoccupations with the sensory, it is people and their stories with which I am forever enraptured. I went back to school as a mature student, having taken voluntary redundancy in 2012, and used my dissertation in 2014 to explore how past prisoners had used music during their sentences. I wrote about that here. I don't know if you can see it on the screen, but in any case, it's freely available online in the Prison Service Journal, a special issue on arts. I have 2 articles in there, in fact. Those I interviewed in the course of this project told me that while in prison, they had used music as a means of exploring emotions. There was otherwise little space to express in the relentless invasions of privacy in the prison environment. Music was used as tactics for navigating prison social spaces and for fashioning a sense of self projected into the future outside and after their prison sentences had concluded. As well as confirming academia was where I wished to remain, subjective distinctions between sound and noise were a constant feature. Little illustrates this as succinctly or persuasive as musical tastes. One person's concerto is another's cacophony. And I was repeatedly transported back to my first visit to a prison, HMP Wandsworth. While still a library assistant, I went there somewhat bizarrely to visit their library, stood in the central control point, and was overwhelmed by the swirling soundscape. I wondered, how was this significant? What did this mean for those living and working within it? And what might it tell us about living and working in the closed social world of the prison? And so in my master's and PhD, I set about seeking answers to these questions, having established that sound conveys, I've completely lost my space. Having established that sound conveys and provides a means of shifting the mood or feeling in prison spaces, my research proposal seeks to extend these investigations into other prison populations as a means of understanding distinctions, both in how different groups experience punishment and how its pains are conveyed via their respective soundscapes. Women prisoners report quiet, indicating calm, whereas in the men's estate, certainly in category B locals, although high security prisons again vary, quiet induces a sense of foreboding and imminent violence. People often refer to the drop in sound before it kicks off. Although conversely, in speech, quiet is a synonym for calm, and it's used in hushed tones. We don't talk about it like the Scottish play. So what does this mean? And does it mean the same in the youth estate, for example? And what what does that mean for predicting and managing violence and safety if it doesn't mean the same thing? This is what I seek to explore in the projects I'm hopefully undertaking at some point in the near future, although who knows when we'll get back into prisons because they are rife with COVID. And so we arrive back at Marinetti and his wonderful moustaches. Marinetti's Zangtum was written from excerpts from journals taken at the scene of battle and published retrospectively. Eleanor March persuasively argues that language is used in prisoner writing to reduce distance between their experience and a wider readership. Through evocative writing and orientation to sensory experience, we can manipulate proximity between participant and researcher, writer and reader, within the walls and beyond them. This thick description enacts a Verstehen, an anti-positivistic qualitative understanding in social science parlance. I argue foregrounding the sensory and resisting tendencies to oculus-centric preoccupations, at least those we are inclined to in much of the global north, holds the potential to disrupt assumptions, to unsettle perspectives, and invite those engaging with this work to expand our understanding and our thinking, and in so doing, acknowledge the pertinence of our feeling and our feelings. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie, for that. Such an interesting talk. It's really quite disturbing.
Sorry, should I have done a warning?
No, not at all. I mean, it's alarming that this is the place we send people with an idea. And some liberals like me think perhaps there's an element of reform. With that noise in the background, what hope is there? Anyway, I shouldn't, but thank you very much for such a thought-provoking talk. And I think we should now move on to our next talk. So if you can stop sharing screen and we move on to Katie.
Mm-hmm.
Katie, around?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me? Can you see me?
Yeah. So Katie's going to talk about the Mongol conquest and urban survival.
Okay, so hopefully you can see my screen. Someone shout at me if you can't. Yep, good. Now for something completely different. That's, I suppose, the joy of these talks. And I'm going to talk today about the Mongol conquest and what happens really to cities in Central Asia in this period. I've used as my opening slide the city of Merv, which is in southeastern Turkmenistan, and this is what it looks like today. You can see it's a pretty desolate place, but rather majestic, and you can see the remains of some of the great buildings, and these are the original defensive walls these ladies are standing on of one of the parts of the city. And there's really this narrative around the Mongols and particularly the conquest of Central Asia and northeastern Iran, that's the end for a lot of the cities, and it sort of precipitates the decline of the great urban nodes of this region that have in many cases been important for centuries and centuries. So I decided to take an archaeological approach to the conquest. I think archaeological narratives have been somewhat underused in historical investigations of the Mongol conquest in particular, compared to some periods when archaeological evidence is much better integrated. So the classical period or even the Arab conquests, we got much better interaction between historians and archaeologists compared to this later period. And what I was interested to look at is, in terms of the urban changes, what is changing in this period in the 13th and 14th centuries, what essentially survives from these cities, what's being revived, and how do these fit into the longer term shifts in the form and function of these cities from the 11th, 12th century right the way through and to the 15th, which is what I'm going to look at in greater detail while I'm at King's. And also just to sort of slightly look at the idea of cities under nomadic rule, because even though the Mongols are probably the most famous of these of these conquering nomads from the steppe. They're certainly not the first. And in fact, Central Asia, the cities of Central Asia have been ruled by a variety of Turkic and indeed in some cases Mongol-speaking groups through the 11th century, right the way until the Mongols arrived. So what happens to cities when they're ruled by people that we might consider nomadic? I mean, they may not have considered themselves, certainly when they were ruling this area. So these are the three cities that I've been looking at in detail over the last 3 or 4 years. And I'm going to talk today about Merv and Otrar because you can see they're in a much more similar geographical environmental zone compared to Barda, which is in the South Caucasus in a much greener, lusher area. And I'm quite interested in the oasis setting of Merv and Otrar. So Otrar's in southern Kazakhstan and Merv is in southeastern Turkmenistan. And you can see the area is really very arid with a series of deserts that are punctuated by these little strands of green coming through and the oasis fans that come from these rivers crisscrossing the deserts. And this, of course, is a really vital area in terms of the interconnectivity of Eurasia, because to the east, you've got China, to the north, you've got the steppe zone, to the south, you've got South Asia, India, Pakistan, and then if you head down to the southwest and west, you have Iran and the Middle East. And this is perhaps considered one of the more tricky areas to cross because of the desert setting, which I think leads to perhaps a greater importance to the cities in this area, because there are relatively few routes you can use across these deserts, and the cities are places you need to stop, but also places where there's a lot of exchange going on, economic exchange, cultural exchange, religious exchange, etc. So they're really important, I think, for really global history, as well as being important and interesting in themselves. So into this situation, the Mongols appear, and this map really shows their enormous scope. So they come, of course, from this area. So Karakorum was their capital, and they came very rapidly westwards. This is the route I'm particularly interested in, the 1219 conquest, where Otrar was conquered somewhere around here, and then Merv was conquered very quickly afterwards in 1221. So it was an incredibly rapid conquest and really exceptional in terms of the speed and scope compared to anything else that had happened before. And by around the 1250s, things have stabilized, and you have all these different khanates and empires, which are ruled primarily by the grandsons of Genghis Khan. So they kind of kept it in the family, but it took a few decades to stabilize. So that's the kind of situation. In terms of the historical sources, they are extensive, actually. They're in multiple languages, but the most useful, comprehensive ones are probably in Persian. Some are in Arabic, of course, lots in Chinese, Armenian, Georgian, etc. There's lots. They're complicated, and it's very difficult for someone to obviously read them all. So I've picked particularly these ones, the Persian and Arabic ones. And the story we get is that there's extensive physical destruction. So you can see the citadel and the walls are being destroyed. This is Otrar, the top one. The second one is the city is set fire to. This is Merv. They burned the tomb of Sultan Sanjar, which is in the center of the city. And if you've been to Merv, you'll know they didn't do a great job because it's still there today. But they do a lot of looting. There's also a narrative of movement of people. So people are conscripted into the Mongol armies and essentially being used in the invasion of the next town. And artisans are being taken off to Mongolia to make nice things for the Mongols, and also to an extent being used as forced labor, so as economic slaves apparently. So it's very, very disruptive and seen as a disaster for this area. So yeah, the key themes: destruction, movement of people. We also see people coming in to provide labor for the depopulated regions. So there's some indications that people are coming from elsewhere to help with harvests, for example, in some of these cities after the conquest. And then there's a few rebellions and then scrapping between the Mongols themselves while they form the borders of their khanates and empires. So it's a pretty disruptive period. So if we look at what these cities look like today, obviously they're both archaeological sites, which is handy for me because I can get at them a bit more easily compared to a city that is still occupied today, like Bukhara or Samarkand, for example. And Merv, I suppose, provides the most poignant example of what is meant to have happened. So there's a series of cities at Merv. This one is actually from the pre-Mongol period. There is activity still in the medieval period in this city, but it's mostly from the 6th century-ish BC. It seems to be abandoned in the early Islamic period, 7th, 8th century. So the main city that the Mongols would have encountered is this enormous egg-shaped one, which is known as Sultan Kala. And it was probably walled in the 10th or 11th century, but there's earlier occupation. This is its citadel up in this area here. And you can see it has 2 enormous suburbs as well. So it's absolutely huge. Estimations of population of the mid 12th century, probably around 150,000, maybe up to 200,000. So about the same size as Cambridge, I suppose, which for this period is enormous. And by the 15th century, you can see this little square down at the bottom. So that was built in the early 15th century. And it seems that the remaining population from this very large city fitted in this one by the 15th century. So you can quickly see the physical impact of what has been blamed on the Mongols, this great depopulation, shrinking of cities. Otrar is slightly smaller. So this is the main citadel area. And the area around, various excavations have taken place in it. There's industrial activity, there's bathhouses, and there's probably some caravanserais and residential areas down there as well. But it's a bit smaller, and it also continued to be inhabited until the 17th or 18th century. So there's a lot of buildup of mud brick structures above the 13th century layers that I'm interested in, which makes it a bit more difficult to look at compared to Merv. But Merv, because it was abandoned around the time of the Mongol conquest, it's really good to look at archaeologically, because we can walk over the surface of the abandoned city and start to look at areas that were still occupied after the conquest through pottery finds. So you can see here, this was the survey carried out by Dave Gilbert from UCL, and he did a walkover survey, and he basically picked up and mapped pottery of the periods that he was interested in, so the post-Mongol period. And you can see that activity is really shrinking into the central bit around Sultan Sanjar, around the mausoleum of Sultan Sanjar, which is right in the center of the city. But there's also a spread coming southwards towards where that later city was built. So you can see already a sort of shift in occupation out of the city, and incidentally upstream on the all-important canals that were feeding the city. A similar survey took place in the Soviet period, undertaken by Zamira Al-Kamova, and she found a similar pattern of a shrinking of occupation around this period. But interestingly, her map shows that the shrinking occurred in the mid-12th century, when there was in fact an attack by the Oghuz Turkic group who were living further to the north. And they actually, historically, we know they captured Sultan Sanjar, who was the ruler of the Seljuk Empire, who his capital was in Merv. So it was seemed to be very disruptive, this nomadic attack in the mid-12th century. And then by the 14th and 15th century, you can see that occupation is really expanding and going down to the south, but doesn't seem to, shrink. Especially, there seems to be a sort of a revival in the 14th and 15th century, which has been somewhat absent from some of the historical narratives, because there aren't many historical sources mentioning Merv in this period. So I was interested to try and see what the occupation looked like physically that was sort of going with this spread of 13th and 14th century pottery, because there's no real surviving buildings from this period, and it was unclear from historical sources what was actually going on. So we revisited this area in the centre of the city. This is the aforementioned Mausoleum of Sultan Sanjar, which was restored in the 1990s, which is why it looks quite smart now. But it was still substantially standing in the 1890s when it was first recorded, and indeed until recent times. So this enormous building here is sort of under interpretation as to what it might be, but it's probably an impressive administrative building that then seems to get reused as something like a bazaar or light industrial area later. So we excavated this area here to come down onto this earlier building, which was probably built in the 11th century, but was still in use by the 12th. So we're looking for information about what date all this material is. And you can see there's later walls that have been built in the pre-excavated trench section, which was excavated in the 1980s, I think, by a Turkish archaeologist who published 2 pages on it. So we don't know a great deal about what happened there. So this is the excavation, and very quickly these pottery sherds came up, which are from the 14th and 15th century. So it's clear there was later occupation in this area. And once we got down a bit further, we found that there were semi-substantial buildings. A lot of them were using reused bricks. So it was clear that this was construction that was probably making use of maybe ruined or abandoned buildings in the vicinity. And the very smart herringbone surface you can see here, which is probably 11th or 12th century and well worn, so it was well used, seems to be covered by this period. So there's been probably a levelling, there's been a sort of abandonment, there's been a levelling of the area, and then people have started building small structures again, sort of for domestic use. And we found hearths and rubbish pits and the usual stuff you would think of people in their domestic day-to-day life. And so some of these were quite nice buildings, but they were mostly made from reused bricks. And we found some fairly nice pottery from the late 13th century to show that there were definitely people still living there. And there's this rather nice piece here with a fish along the rim, which is meant to be inspired by Chinese iconography. Is meant to be inspired by Chinese iconography, and this is one of the hallmarks of the Mongol period that people often see in art history. So it was nice to see some of these shells as well. And elsewhere in the city, there are further signs that people are definitely still living in Merv post 1221 when it was conquered by the Mongols. And this excavation was undertaken by a team from UCL and the British Museum. And it's a sort of palatial structure, very fancy house in the Sharia Arc, in the citadel of the medieval city. And there was extensive reoccupation here. So it was probably built in the mid-12th century and then reoccupied through the 13th and 14th century, and it was actually subdivided into smaller rooms. So you could see that the fancy building was no longer useful. It was being used for more practical purposes. And the floor had actually been raised, and in a later period, you can see this lovely carved stucco design, which is mid-12th century, had been chopped off, and the whole area had been replastered, but in a much plainer design. So you can see little signs of the deterioration in this area. And this is some nice pottery from probably the 12th century or early 13th. And then this is much, much later pottery, probably 14th century. But the main buildings that survive in Merv today are the mausolea and the shrines. And there is a clear continuity in use of these buildings, and they were definitely still being used long after there were people still living in a kind of urban way in the city. This one is called Kizbibi, and this is a picture of it in the 1920s. It was recorded extensively in, I think, around the 1950s, and there were lots of inscriptions inside on the surviving plaster that showed people who'd been there on pilgrimages, and had given money for its upkeep from the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries. And unfortunately, all that plaster fell off sometime in the late 20th century before it could be recorded. And it now looks like this structure here. But you can see also that in the mud brick city, it's one of the few fired brick buildings and therefore survives much better. An excavation took place outside of this structure in the 1990s and also found a lot of late materials. So this pottery is probably 14th century, this stuff's more like 15th and 16th century, but it's quite high quality, fancy stuff. So it seems that there's definitely activity going on in this area well into the sort of 15th and 16th century, and the inscriptions inside the little mausoleum also suggest that. But most interestingly to me was the excavation of a possible, well, probable Buddhist shrine in the south of the city, which must have been built by the Mongols, because they're the only, I mean, they were nominally Buddhist, even though they practiced several different religious activities, shamanic practices, etc., through the period. But this shrine was excavated in the 1950s, and it was interpreted by the excavators as having a sort of pagoda roof. So I've put an example of what I mean by that in the red box. This is from Xi'an in China. But the excavators were convinced that it had this very impressive roof because it had an enormous amount of tiles that were smashed up, covering the whole structure. And the decorations they found inside were also very interesting. There's a sort of mixture of Islamic design in these tiles. There were roof tiles with script on, which was identified as Chinese at the time, but actually probably is more like a Turkic script or some sort of Tamga. I've showed it to lots of people and no one can tell me what it is. So if anyone has any ideas, I would love to hear. But there were several of these circular roof tiles which fitted on these ends of the roofs here, with interesting kind of animalistic designs that probably came from the steppe. And there's also the sort of weird dragon feature, which was interpreted as coming off one of the corners. So this shows us that the Mongols also invested in Merv, even though it was outside of the main city. So they're sort of shifting the center already to the south. This is right on the southern edge. And one of the reasons that the Pugachenkova, the excavator, was pretty convinced it was a Buddhist shrine was, one, the very Chinese nature of the structure and the interesting fusion of steppe, Islamic and Chinese design, but also because it was completely destroyed. It had been very obviously, purposefully smashed up. Everything was in smithereens apparently when they found it. And this she equated with an episode in the 1290s. So in 1295, the Ilkhans, who were the rulers of this area, converted to Islam, and there was an order that all the Buddhist shrines should be destroyed. And so at Merv, we have, I think, possibly the only example of a Buddhist shrine that's been excavated in this part of the world. So it's a really interesting fusion of all the different artistic styles, and something that, when we're thinking of complete destruction of something, is not maybe what we expect to find. So if we look at the overall status of the city by the 1240s, 50s onwards, so after the conquest, and compile all the information, there's a lot of really useful information here. So we have a potter's quarter that was abandoned almost exactly at the time of the Mongol conquest. There's accounts of workshops being completely abandoned with clay still sitting in its courtyard ready for working. There's a house excavated up here that there was a whole assemblage of food still with bones in the plates, apparently excavated by guys in the 1960s. And there's a sort of shift of industrial activity already happening inside the city. So there is a shrinking before the Mongols come, but there does seem to be a very stressed event where there's an immediate depopulation, things literally abandoned, you know, the same day. And then we can see the gradual depopulation continuing. So there's the palatial residences up here, which had that nice stucco design that was reoccupied for a long time after. You start seeing glassworking and industrial activity right in the center of the city, in the previous city center, in the administrative area, which sort of is also being used as a sign of decline. And then we have continued sort of religious use of the site. So there's the mosque here that was excavated outside of Kizbibi, and then there's another mosque here that's meant to be quite late, and the Buddhist shrine is right down here in the south. So again, you can probably see a slight shift of activity to the south. So that's what happens at Merv. So at Otrar, I'm going to very quickly rush through Otrar, and that's what it looks like now. So you can see the raised Shahristan or sort of citadel area, and then this is the area around, which has a lot of further activity. This was extensively excavated from around the 1960s to the 1980s, and they're still excavating, the Kazakhs are still excavating there today. So we have a lot of really good information about the site, but mostly relating from the 14th to the 18th centuries because of the depth of the Mongol period deposits. There's a lot of late activity here, so certainly post-Mongol conquest, Otrar is really thriving. So there's a 13th, 14th century bathhouse being excavated down here, a massive mosque, you can see it's absolutely huge here. There's a refortification of the defences, probably in the 14th century as well. And then there's extensive, you can see all the residential houses spread all across the mound. And I'm just going to quickly go through this little bit here, OTR 1, which was in a trench that was excavated in the 1980s. And this was an area where the excavators identified a significant period of abandonment that they equated with the Mongol conquest. So this is the pre-Mongol buildings here. You can see these little tightly packed mud brick houses. And these are the plans they made of them. And one of the reasons they were convinced there was a fairly long running abandonment of the site was because there was a big lump of dirt between the two episodes of architecture, but also there was a complete shift in the layout of the property boundaries, which is often a sign that you know, the whole thing is abandoned and rebuilt. So there's an overlay here where this street here should be going through about here. You can see the overlay of the later buildings on top of them. So they were pretty convinced there was a relatively long abandonment, but how long it was, they weren't sure. And so I decided to go back and see if I could work out, using slightly more precise techniques and radiocarbon dating, how long this abandonment might be. So I found in OTR1 that little thing I showed you on the map in the north of the site. This is essentially the edge of an archaeological trench, and I've drawn all the layers that have built up over time, which tell us the story of how the site was occupied. So this is the phase 4 architecture. This is the post-Mongol architecture, and you can see there's a building here, that's the edge of the wall, and then this is an oven, a buried oven, and that's approximately the floor surface. There's a slightly disturbed brick floor here. This is the alleged abandonment period in the middle, but as you can see, there's several floors been building up here. And this is the phase 5 architecture, which is the pre-Mongol layout of the city. Luckily, there was a lot of archaeobotanical material. These are charred buckwheat grains that have been stored in one of the houses. And this is felt that has been charred and in a fallen down roof. And I could also collect soil samples from some of these remains and floated them, which basically means I poured water on them and sieved out all the seeds. And through careful analysis of all the layers, I could pick out different samples from across my archaeological section, and I could date them and get nice precise dates. So here are some of the things I picked out. Mostly seeds, they're the best things to date because they form over 1 year, and things like reed and twigs are also really handy. So here's my section and here are the dates. So you can see the span of the samples from across the section. So I tried to cover as much as I could, and I'll show you a slightly easier to understand drawing with the dates. And so I'd been looking for the 13th and 14th centuries to try and understand what happened in the Mongol conquest, and you'll see there's a gaping hole in dates from the 13th and 14th centuries. But what that made me realize is that obviously the abandonment doesn't date to the Mongol conquest of 1220. the abandonment is actually much, much earlier of Otrar. And you can see by 1150, there's nothing basically happening, even in that abandonment period. So the structures must date to a lot earlier, probably to the 11th century. And the reoccupation in this area probably doesn't happen until the 14th century, because that related to the last firing of the oven. So coin data, I went and had a look at that to see if that corroborated things. There's lots of lovely catalogues of coins. And if you look at the assemblages of coins, the yellow and the green is the 12th and 13th century. There's almost none, even in the period that's meant to be the revival in the 13th century. Much later coins, loads of later coins, and loads of earlier coins, which means that Otrar, at least the top of Otrar, the Shahristan, the higher bit, was abandoned when the Mongols are meant to have conquered it, which is quite intriguing, because I then went and looked at coins from across the site, and there is very, very little evidence of 12th century occupation. So the evocative stories we get, like this picture here, this is from the Otrar Museum, of a thriving city being conquered by the Mongols, in the case of Otrar, is possibly not quite what we expect. So either people are not living in this city, Otrar is somehow another city, or we need to reassess what we think of as a city in this period. And this feeds into ideas of what's going on in terms of nomads ruling cities. Are they actually cities as we might think? So I'll just very briefly conclude here, because I think I'm pretty much out of time. But Merv fits the Mongol conquest very well. It has a sudden abandonment, it shrinks, but this process takes a very, very long time. It takes probably 3 centuries, from the initial decline in the 12th century to its not complete abandonment, rebuilding essentially in the 15th century, and shift southwards. The abandonment at Otrar pre-exists the arrival of the Mongols, and that is confusing. I can't explain that yet, and that's something I hope to look at more while I'm at King's. And for some reason, while Merv is declining, Otrar is thriving. So by the 14th and 15th century, we have intensive occupation in Otrar. And I'd like to look a bit more also about the role of the earlier nomadic rulers, particularly the Turkic Khanids and the Mongol-speaking Karakitai, to try and understand what's happening to cities in the period before the Mongols arrive. So with that, I will thank all these people and thank you all for listening. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Katie. That's been magnificent. So thank you both for such wonderful talks. And I am about to stop recording.